Welcome, Jake. So lovely to meet you, and thanks so much for coming.
Thanks for having me.
And I was wondering if you could tell me a little bit about what your passion is and what you love to invest in.
Sure. Well, at Gelt Venture Capital, we're a seed stage fund, so we invest in founders relatively early on in their life cycle. Um, we don't do anything in the purely consumer space. So most things are B2B or enterprise, but I focus in mostly on what falls under the general category these days of frontier tech. And so those are companies that are pushing the bounds in some way of technology. And so it's not your standard sort of CRM kind of company or a mobile app, but someone working on technology that 5 years ago couldn't have possibly existed or maybe would have existed just in a research lab. And so for us, that falls into various categories. So we look at drone aircraft, we look at autonomy, so self-driving cars, or other autonomous kinds of objects these days, robotics, which really flow into all of that, application of machine learning and artificial intelligence, which is being used in a lot of robotic systems and self-driving vehicles. So all of these things sort of tie together in sort of the future that we're trying to invest in, and aerospace as well.
And so, from this amazing space that you're interviewing and talking to entrepreneurs, how do you see the future looking?
It's a great question. I think the future looks much more different than people today think it's going to look. So most people think that self-driving cars are 20 or 30 years away. We've invested in a company that right now is driving cargo trucks in Florida and delivering cargo without drivers.
I've seen that, yeah.
Yeah, and so it's here. It makes sense for it to start with businesses. So carrying cargo, there's more money in it, and it's a little bit easier to manage the safety and the risk there than it is with human drivers. But I think that's one example of things that are going to change dramatically and in a lot shorter of a time frame than most people think. So I'll give you an example.
Yeah.
When we transitioned from horse and buggy to cars, it took from about 1908 to 1924. So 1908 is when the Model T was released. I think 1912 is when the assembly line really kicked into gear. 1924 is when there were basically no more horses in. 1924 is when cars outnumbered horses in the country.
Okay.
Right? And I think it was by 1916 there were no more horses in the city of New York and in most major metropolitan areas. And so that's a 4-year span you replaced horses with cars in cities.
Wow.
It's a 15-year span where you replaced basically horses across the country. And if you think about what it took to replace horse and buggy with cars, you had to build major infrastructure, gas stations, paved roads all over the country. To replace today's cars with self-driving cars, very little infrastructure change. And then you think, but we have this massive install base, hundreds of millions of cars in the US. Well, as it turns out, you only need about 10% the number of vehicles, if they're autonomous, to manage all of traffic. So 10% of the active cars on the road equates to about, I think it's 11 million cars, which given the number of cars we produce and sell every year in the US, is only about a year and a half's worth of car production. So in theory, within a year and a half, we could produce a fully autonomous fleet of self-driving cars to handle everyone's transportation needs in the country. That's a little bit aggressive, but I think it's a little pessimistic to think that it's 20 years away. I think that future is maybe 10 years away, tops. And so when you start to imagine just that one change, and you look at all the second level effects that come from that, you start seeing cities change dramatically. You don't need parking lots anymore because cars park themselves outside of the cities. That means that apartment buildings right now that have half the land is given to car use or a whole floor is underground parking, that becomes all housing. You have streets where there may be a 2-lane street, but effectively there's an additional 2 lanes on the street that are given over to parking that can now become sidewalks and bike lanes or other housing. And so you're going to see dramatic changes in cities because of self-driving cars. Or you think about the fact that right now most homes have a 2-car garage.
Yes.
If you're not parking a car in your 2-car garage anymore, that equates to about 450 square feet of living space that homeowners are going to start to recapture. So what do they do with that living space? Well, kids are maybe moving back in with their families, so you're converting that into bedrooms. Maybe you're turning it into an Airbnb. Maybe you're storing all your stuff in your garage and taking it out of public storage.
Yeah.
But the point is that there are massive second level effects to just
Yeah.
this one change. And so
Yeah.
I think that the world in 10 years is going to be much more different than people today think it's going to be.
Well, thanks for that little peek in there. I wouldn't have expected that to be happening so quickly. I always like to ask the investors if they have an unusual or funny or different story about being an investor, just so we can get a peek into your life.
Sure, sure. So I mean, most of the entrepreneurs I talk with are, let's say, between the ages of 20 and 40, or 20 and 45, something like that. But every once in a while, we get someone outside the spectrum on the age ends there. And I was contacted not too long ago by a couple of high school kids out in the Midwest that were, I think, 13 and 14 at the time. They reached out. And I was really impressed that they reached out to me cold, but they did some background research on some stuff I had written and some stuff I've done. This was a very tailored outreach. So I took a call with them, gave them some advice on a company they were starting, and then heard back from them about 3 months later. They were starting something else. They had pivoted their company. And then they came out from the Midwest to a conference out to San Francisco by themselves without their parents, which I was really impressed by. I mean, these are just a couple of high school kids. Met with them then, kept talking to them over the phone. They ended up getting into Y Combinator this last year, and they were the youngest applicants ever accepted into Y Combinator. And I think they're still in high school. They just launched a company that's in the enterprise SaaS space doing, I think, like marketing automation. And they've raised a bunch of money from some really well-known investors. Just really blew me away that these guys they've done more before the age of 18 than I've done. I'm 36 now, and
And so good of you to encourage them and to, respond to them. And I think, obviously, you see so many unprepared pitches and reach out. So to see someone that young to be actually prepared and doing their homework is fantastic, right?
Absolutely, yeah. It's rare and impressive when you see it.
Thank you so much for coming. I'm so looking forward to the chat with you and Anne.
Yeah, thanks for having us.